In Search of has investigated the mystery of many ancient monuments, the pyramids, Stonehenge, and Easter Island. A solution to these puzzles may be concealed in Florida's Coral Castle. This monumental structure was created by one man with his bare hands in the 20th century. What strange forces created this castle of secrets?
This series presents information based in part on theory and conjecture. The producer's purpose is to suggest some possible explanations, but not necessarily the only ones, to the mysteries we will examine.
Coral Castle has been called the eighth wonder of the world. This place is a fantasy garden and an engineering marvel. The blocks are cut and set with great precision, locked without mortar. At 30 tons, the greatest single stone in Coral Castle is twice as massive as any in the pyramids. Here are massive megaliths, huge astrological symbols, and structures whose purpose is a total mystery. Surprisingly, 25 miles away is cosmopolitan Miami. Coral Castle was built not in ancient times, but in the 20th century. Most curious of all, Coral Castle was built in secret by one man, Edward Leedskalnin, a frail little hermit. With no modern machinery and with no help, he somehow hand-carved and lifted every single block, a total of 3 million pounds.
With all our modern technology, we might be able to duplicate the pyramids. But how could we ever do it with our bare hands? Dreamers beyond the fringe of science have postulated a long-lost art of harnessing anti-gravity. It seems incredible, but Ed Leedskalnin may have rediscovered these ancient secrets. Let's look at his life story.
The mystery of Coral Castle began in rural South Florida just after World War I. Settlers and land speculators began to move down from the East Coast, displacing the indigenous Seminole Indians. The newcomers found a humid, sprawling tropical land, full of mosquitoes and opportunities. The great Florida land boom was on. In 1919, as recreated here, a real estate man named Moser was scouting land along back roads near the Everglades. He spotted a stranger. At first, he thought it was a boy and was surprised to encounter a very small grown man. The stranger couldn't weigh more than 90 pounds. Moser, always friendly, offered a ride. The little man introduced himself, Edward Leedskalnin. Recently immigrated from Latvia, he said with a smile. Was searching this part of Florida for a specific plot of land. Moser realized the little man had advanced tuberculosis. Mrs. Moser always welcomed the strangers her husband brought home. Life was lonely in this new land. Edward Leedskalnin was very friendly, very polite, and confessed outright he hadn't a penny to his name. The Mosers selflessly took young Ed into their home and nursed him back to health. They listened with respect to his story of leaving Latvia, of his search all over America for the right type of land. "I'll know when I find it," he said. "It's for my sweet 16. He would never explain who she was, but Ed was obviously haunted by a dream or a memory of land and a castle for his sweet 16. As soon as he regained his health, Ed continued searching the backcountry. Crazy Ed and his rusty bike became the butt of many local jokes. Neighbors, watching him prod the ground, began rumors that he was hunting for buried treasure. Ed always rejected the good farmland. When people wondered why, he only smiled. Finally, he excitedly brought Moser to a remote plot. Moser was astounded, for Ed had unerringly located the worst acre in the state. It was all bedrock, right up to the surface. You couldn't plow it, you couldn't farm it. Moser gladly gave a small section to his friend. A few weeks later, Moser's curiosity got the better of him. He dragged his wife out through the brush to see what Ed could possibly do with that land. They couldn't believe their eyes. Ed had somehow cut a 10-ton block of solid coral right out of the bedrock and hoisted it into the air. As they nervously approached his flimsy tripod and the block which could crush them in an instant, they realized there was something more than craziness in Ed. How did he do it? Ed smiled and said, "It's not difficult, really. The secret is in knowing how." Why did he do it? He smiled again. "Someday, my sweet 16 will come." Working alone, he cut more blocks. All the locals had to visit and gape at this accomplishment. Ed was friendly, but firm. He would never tell his secret techniques, and he would always stop work when people came near. Trying to catch him at work, the neighbors took to spying. Some people swear they saw the rocks move. Ed could somehow sense their inquiring gaze. He would simply stop working and patiently wait until they gave up trying to discover his secrets. "60 years later, the completed coral castle still embodies a number of unsolved mysteries. Francis Wilson.
This block weighs 9 tons. It's just one piece of rock. See what you can do with one hand?
He's quite interested in safety, I know that, and he always wanted to make sure the children couldn't get down in here, and that was his gate to keep children from going down the steps.
Those who knew Ed remember him with great respect. Charles Williams and Bodil Lowe.
I guess I was maybe 6, 7 years old. I was born and raised about 300 yards from this place, and I would see Ed quite often at the little country store we had, and he was a very slight man. I don't think he was probably any taller than I am. I'm about 5'6". Probably weighed somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 pounds. He always looked frail and sickly, but obviously very strong.
He'd say this is because of the stars and the moon, and he would go on and he would show us his electrical machine. Now he made electricity, and he would jump in his bathtub and show how the water would come to certain levels and how he heated it with the sun. And he'd always divert your question.
As I say, a very gentle, kind person, and he was, of course, highly intelligent. Many people thought he was a little cracked because he was smarter, I think, than they were, probably.
His whole life and whole being was very frugal. Just sustained himself, I think, more or less.
And some nights we'd come in the moonlight and sit and walk around in his park. And he would come out and tell us his story if he had a small audience. And he would go along in a very normal sort of a voice, and then we'd ask him why he did it. And they'd say, oh, well, someday my sweet 16 is coming, and he'd look up in the stars, and he would get very ethereal in his voice, and he just loved talking about his sweet 16.
Then he always spoke of her as sweet 16. She never grew any older. It's kind of nice.
There were many rumors about mysterious Ed. One held that he was an eccentric miser and kept a stash of money. Late one evening in the 1930s, a band of toughs waited until he was alone in Coral Castle. Little Ed could never have imagined such a shocking intrusion into his private world. The attack prompted the most extraordinary feat of his life. Coral Castle was originally built in a remote area of Florida. For years, Ed Leedskalnin felt safe in isolation, away from the harsh realities of the cities. He had carved this place with his bare hands as a Shangri-La for his sweet 16. Barely surviving a brutal robbery, however, Ed decided to seek safer ground. When he moved, Ed took more than his toothbrush. He took Coral Castle itself. He hired a local truck owner and with characteristic secrecy, politely asked the man to step around the corner. The truck would be loaded in just a minute. Piece by piece, Ed moved all 3 million pounds of rock 10 miles to its present location near Homestead, Florida. As usual, no one ever managed to see how he lifted the giant rocks, which weighed up to 30 tons apiece. How did he do it? There are many theories. 60 million years ago, this was all of South Florida. Thousands of miles of living coral reef. The rock which he used, fossil coral, may have internal forces which only Ed understood. A huge brain coral seems almost conscious, perhaps contemplating ancient secrets. Living coral constructs its own undersea castles. Forces deep in the earth fuse dead coral into oolite, a dense, strong organic rock. And most of South Florida has little topsoil over this bedrock. We asked the men at a rock quarry to try an experiment, to cut and lift a giant block of oolite. With diamond-tipped power saws, the cutting alone took several hours. The only way to break the block free, brute force. Then the test. Could they detect any unusual buoyancy in the rock itself? Using a 600 horsepower crane, could they lift the rock? After the crane almost tipped over, they managed to drag the block a few yards. What modern equipment would it take to duplicate Coral Castle?
It couldn't be done.
Charles Valois comments.
Not with the modern equipment. I wouldn't cut more than 4 foot long and 32 inches wide and 7 or 8 foot long. That's the most I'll cut. And you see the struggle I have getting it out with that machine.
This is the only known photo of Ed apparently working. Although he seems to be breaking the block free with wedges, a close look reveals that the block is already cut free, with a cable underneath. Engineers have been puzzled by this photo. Bruce Cathy has extensively studied and written on Earth forces. He believes that a harmonic grid inside the Earth's surface can create actual anti-gravity at certain nodes on the grid, and that Coral Castle was built on a position of harmonic resonance.
He's moved stones up to coral blocks up to 25 tons, and he'd put them up overnight just on his own. After he died, I checked some of the instruments he was using, and they're very, very primitive. Chisels and hammers and ropes and pulleys and things. Nobody can understand even today now how he done this. I found when I applied the harmonic mathematical basis to his position on the Earth's surface geometrically, that the same harmonic values popped up on the area where he was. He always said that he had the secrets of anti-gravity and magnetic fields, and he also said that he knew how they built the pyramids. So it appears if he was telling the truth that it looks like he did have these secrets.
Ed performed many strange experiments with magnetism, although he had no source of conventional electricity. He hinted to neighbors he was on the verge of a monumental breakthrough and published his preliminary results. His book, however, is as incomprehensible as Einstein's unified field theory. Just as Ed always worked in secret, he also preferred to take his own photographs, posing in his one suit with a self-timed box brownie. These films are not the best quality, but they are the only known movies of Ed Leedskalnin. They were discovered in 1980 in the back of a closet. They reveal the Ed that most visitors knew. Animated, friendly, a simple man.
With this same simplicity, Ed awoke one morning in December of 1951. He put on his one suit, hopped a bus, and checked into Miami's county hospital. The doctors were appalled to find him near death from malnutrition. For a while, he rallied under their care, and then died quietly in his sleep.
Even after his death, Ed left a few surprises. Neighbors guarded the grounds until authorities could make an official investigation. They found his living quarters as Spartan and as ingenious as the rest of Coral Castle. They also found $3,800 in crisp $100 bills and what resembled a treasure map. All attempts to follow the directions on the map were futile. Nothing seemed to correspond to our normal three-dimensional geometry. Ed left many mysteries, a lot of money, and a castle for his sweet 16. Was she a real person? Or was she a dream, an ideal of all that is good? Children love to visit Coral Castle. They instinctively respond to the childlike sense of play which is so magnificently sculpted here. In his life, Edward Leedskalnin carved and lifted over 3 million pounds of rock. Yet there is one small stone weighing 50 pounds, which he never managed to lift. Ironically, on both sides of his simple grave in Miami are the graves of 2 little children. We think he would have felt at home. November 22nd, 1963. A lone figure walks to a window in the Texas School Book Depository. In a matter of seconds, the President of the United States will be mortally wounded, and the name Lee Harvey Oswald will be etched in history. But did Oswald really kill President Kennedy? New evidence points to the possibility that he did not.
This series presents information based in part on theory and conjecture. The producer's purpose is to suggest some possible explanations, but not necessarily the only ones, to the mysteries we will examine.
During the Cold War era of the early 1960s, President John F. Kennedy is to become the most admired leader of the free world.
There are many people in the world who really don't understand, or say they don't, what is the great issue between the free world and the communist world. Let them come to Berlin.
His attraction is magnetic. Seldom has one man unified the people of so many democratic nations. In October 1962, President Kennedy learns of the buildup of Soviet missiles in Cuba and orders a blockade of Cuban harbors. It results in one of the most humiliating political defeats in Russian history. Little more than a year later, the leader of the Western world is assassinated. There are some who blame the Soviets, but nothing can be proved. Within hours, Lee Harvey Oswald, ex-Marine, former Russian defector, and as we have come to believe, a distraught and frustrated young man, is in custody. Before Oswald can tell his full story, he is murdered in front of millions of television viewers. Almost a year later, the Warren Commission delivers its verdict on the Kennedy assassination. Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. He was not a part of a conspiracy. The Warren Commission concluded there were 3 shots fired during the assassination, all of them coming from behind the president out of a Texas school book depository window. But many witnesses to the assassination claimed that at least 1 shot came from the grassy knoll situated to the right and front of the president's car. In spite of these contradictory accounts, the conclusions reached by the Warren Commission would officially stand until startling new evidence came to light. It was a recording that had been overlooked for 15 years. The tape should never have existed at all. At the time of the assassination, the microphone on a police motorcycle was jammed in the on position, transmitting sound to police headquarters, where it was routinely recorded. When the shots were fired in Dallas, the microphone picked up those sounds. But the tape, and you're listening to the actual sound now, was seemingly indecipherable. If the sounds of gunshots were there, they were impossible to detect by the human ear. In 1978, Dr. James Barger of the acoustic firm Bolt, Beranek, and Newman attempted to find those gunshots.
We began our analysis by recording the tape into the computer. We digitized the data and made a file. Then we had the computer filter this file in order to remove the sound of the motorcycle as much as we could. The motorcycle noise is repetitive. The piston fires repetitively. The filter was taught to recognize that sound and to eliminate it. We then had the computer make a long paper picture of these filtered sounds. The picture was about 500 feet long, and it represented a pictorial view of the filtered sounds for the whole 5.5 minutes that the motorcycle microphone was stuck open. We examined that entire 500 feet of acoustical waveform to see if there were any waveforms that looked like they might represent gunfire. In fact, we did find in 6 places where sound bursts indicated the possibility of gunfire on the Dallas police tape. At this time, we realized we needed a more careful, a more stringent analysis technique, one that would definitely determine whether these impulsive sounds were gunfire or whether they were extraneous noise.
The more stringent technique Dr. Barger needed resulted in one of the most unique scientific experiments of this century. Dr. Barger and his team returned to Dallas to perform a sound recreation of the Kennedy assassination. Shots were recorded at various places at the assassination site for later comparison with the motorcycle tape.
At the end of our analysis, we were able to conclude that there had been at least 4 shots fired during the assassination. 3 of these had been fired from the Texas School Book Depository and 1 from the grassy knoll.
The Texas School Book Depository is located next to the grassy knoll, along the parkway the president's motorcade had traveled. Bob Groden, a photo optics specialist, attempted to synchronize an enhanced version of the motorcycle tape with the famous Zapruder film, an 8mm home movie shot by a motorcade observer. This synchronization, shown now for the first time on nationwide television, reveals with shocking clarity that at least 2 gunmen had to have been involved, one firing from behind the president, the other from the right front. At least 4 shots were fired, but it's the third, the one from the front, the grassy knoll, that kills the president. The motorcycle tape and Dr. Barger's testimony eventually led to United States government acknowledgement that the assassination of John F. Kennedy was the probable result of a conspiracy. Where did that conspiracy originate? Less than 2 months after the assassination, Yuri Ivanovich Nosenko, a high-level Russian KGB agent, defected to the United States. As recreated here for In Search Of, Nosenko told American CIA officers that as part of his duties, he had personally supervised the KGB file on Lee Harvey Oswald while Oswald lived in Russia. Nosenko assured the Americans that Oswald had no relations with Soviet intelligence and acted without Soviet knowledge in the assassination of President Kennedy. Many of the CIA officers found serious discrepancies in Nosenko's story and suspected that Nosenko was sent here by the KGB to mislead the Americans about Oswald's Soviet connections. To prove his honesty, Nosenko agreed to submit to a lie detector examination. The key questions: did Nosenko supervise the KGB file on Lee Harvey Oswald?
Yes.
And was Lee Harvey Oswald involved in any way with the intelligence activities of the KGB?
No. How many times?
According to the results of the polygraph test, Yuri Ivanovich Nosenko was a liar. Some sources close to the CIA claim that Nosenko was then put under hostile interrogation.
Isn't that right, Jody? You have that report.
Treated more like a captured spy than a defector, Nosenko was put through grueling, unrelenting, and abusive interrogation. As flawed as Nosenko's story was, he refused to break, clinging instead to absurd and indefensible explanations. Though Nosenko did not break, the CIA officers were certain that when the Warren Commission questioned Nosenko, it too would find his story unbelievable. But the Warren Commission never questioned Nosenko. One man who thinks he knows why is Edward Epstein, noted authority on the Warren Commission. Epstein believes that the commission was misinformed by the FBI.
The last thing J. Edgar Hoover wanted was to open up the investigation into Lee Harvey Oswald's connections with the Soviet Union. And if the Warren Commission began to question Lysenko, it would lead exactly in that direction. Remember, the FBI is in charge of internal security in the United States. Here was Lee Harvey Oswald, who came over from Russia, a defector who had given out the secrets of state to the Russians. Well, the FBI should have been keeping a closer eye on him. If suddenly it turned out through the questioning of Lysenko that Oswald was a Soviet agent, then the FBI would be held responsible for why weren't they keeping Oswald under surveillance. And that's the reason that J. Edgar Hoover did not want to open up the questioning into Lysenko and did not want to get into the area of Oswald's connections with the Soviet Union.
If Lysenko was part of a Russian plot, did it include the assassination of President Kennedy? Lee Harvey Oswald was born in New Orleans in October 1939. His father had died 2 months before. His childhood was marked by instability, moving with his mother from house to house, city to city. By the time he was 10, he had attended 6 different public schools. While he was regarded as friendly and likable, his teachers detected something hidden within him, a certain tenseness. When he was 17, Oswald fulfilled a long-time ambition and joined the Marine Corps, where he served honorably for 3 years. Following his discharge in 1959, Oswald abruptly renounced his American citizenship and defected to the Soviet Union. It is the next 2 years that we know the least about Oswald. In 1961, Oswald returned to the United States, reclaiming his American citizenship. With him, he brought a Russian wife, Marina, and a diary describing his life while in Russia. The diary tells the story of a bitter young man becoming increasingly disillusioned with the communist system. However, the diary also contains some puzzling discrepancies. Could it be a fake? Another attempt by the Russians to mislead us? To find out, we went to the National Archives in Washington, D.C. to interview internationally known handwriting analyst Tia Stein-Lewinson. Mrs. Lewinson had spent more than 4 months working on the Oswald diary, putting it through microscopic scrutiny before she arrived at her evaluation.
This is not a spontaneous writing. It is written very slowly and deliberately. One could assume that possibly Oswald copied excerpts from his original diary, which were given to him by some representative of Soviet intelligence, and that he then wrote very slowly in order to comply with the demands. However, here and there one can see that he gets irritated, and especially at the end of the pages, he frequently gets quite fatigued.
Mrs. Lewinson believes that fatigue in Oswald's writing, as shown here by lines that gradually run downhill, indicates that the complete diary was written in 2 or 3 sessions, rather than day by day.
I think that Oswald was supervised by Soviet intelligence in order to mislead the Americans at his return to the United States.
Edward Epstein.
When I went through Lee Harvey Oswald's diary, I found 2 anachronisms, 2 things that were out of date. One was on October 31st, where he talked about the American consul, McVicker, who wasn't yet the consul for another year. The second thing was he talked about rubles in terms of old rubles that were 10 for $1 rather than new rubles that were 1 for $1. This was not a genuine diary. It was a fake. It was written after the fact to give Lee Harvey Oswald a legend so he could explain to the FBI and other people in America what he was doing in Russia for 2 years, what he was supposed to be doing in Russia, not what he was doing.
If Oswald's diary is in fact a fake, and if Nosenko only defected to mislead the Americans, it leads one to ask, what were the Russians trying to hide? What happened to Oswald during his stay in the Soviet Union that the Russians don't want us to know about? Could there have been a plot so bizarre no one would have dared thought it possible? On November 24th, 1963, medical examiners began an autopsy on the individual they assumed to be Lee Harvey Oswald. It is recreated here for In Search Of. Their findings were to create a public controversy that would surface 15 years later, when British lawyer, author, and investigator Michael Eddowes made public the results of his investigation of Lee Harvey Oswald.
This is the most terrifying story you will ever hear, and the Russians don't want you to hear about it. The man who killed President Kennedy was not Lee Harvey Oswald. He was a Soviet look-alike whose first name was Alec, and who came to the United States as a member of the KGB assassination squad for the direct purpose of killing President Kennedy.
Eddowes says that the Dallas autopsy was performed on an imposter and points to a number of inconsistencies to prove his point.
The man who went to Russia was 5 feet 11 in height. There's no question about this. There are 11 recordings of this height. The length of the corpse of the assassin was 5 feet 9.
External examination reveals a 5'9" white male.
The autopsy report records only 2 scars on the upper left arm of the assassin.
Over the left arm, there's a 1/4 inch transverse scar and a 1 1/4 inch scar.
Got it.
Whereas the real Oswald had 3 scars on the upper left arm. The autopsy report records a large scar on the inner aspect of the left wrist. The real Oswald had no such scar. At the age of 6, the real Oswald had a mastoidectomy operation, which left a 1 inch long scar behind his left ear over the mastoid bone. The part of the mastoid bone was itself removed, and at the operation a rubber dam drain was inserted. So there was not only a scar, there was a depression in the flesh and a hole in the head of about 1 dime in size.
An examination of Oswald's Marine Corps records confirms the existence of the mastoidectomy scar behind Oswald's left ear.
Now, the autopsy doctors, experienced pathologists, cut up over both mastoid areas to remove the scalp so they could take off the top of the head to examine the brain. In doing this, they could not have failed to have seen the 1 inch scar and the hole in the head. The autopsy report does not record the scar, does not record the depression, and although the skull was x-rayed, does not disclose the hole in the skull.
Eddowes requested that Tarrant County officials exhume the body buried under the name of Lee Harvey Oswald. His request was rejected, and Eddowes has since taken legal action in state court. Could there have been 2 Oswalds? Eddowes claims the picture on the right is the second Oswald, the Russian impersonator. Imposter or not, the bigger mystery remains. Who fired the shot from the grassy knoll? In 1967, Jimmy Hoffa began serving a 13-year prison sentence. It was the beginning of the end
for the man who was called America's most powerful labor leader. Hoffa was pardoned 4 years later, but his troubles were far from over. On July 30th, 1975, he left home and disappeared without a trace. Was Jimmy Hoffa kidnapped or murdered? If so, why and by whom? Did he flee to a distant country? Why did Jimmy Hoffa disappear?
This series presents information based in part on theory and conjecture. The producer's purpose is to suggest some possible explanations, but not necessarily the only ones, to the mysteries we will examine.
Be firm, but return to work and wait for the government of the United States to be able to make the decision. Don't take the law in your own hands or you're going to hurt me. Don't do it, please.
As president of the Teamsters Union, Jimmy Hoffa commanded a workforce larger than the United States Army. Hoffa was a leader gifted with great charisma, one of America's working-class heroes. One day in 1975, Hoffa went to a meeting at a suburban Detroit restaurant. He has not been seen since.
My father, James R. Hoffa, has been missing for some 32 hours. He left for an appointment at Max's Red Fox restaurant at approximately 1:30 p.m. Wednesday, July 30, 1975. He called home at approximately 2:15 p.m. We have not heard from him since.
Down in this lot here.
Acting on anonymous tips, local authorities searched the Detroit suburbs for a body. Jimmy Hoffa is still missing. He was a powerful man, president of the world's largest labor union. But powerful men make enemies. Who might have wanted Hoffa out of the way, and why? Is it conceivable that he was kidnapped for ransom, or that he deliberately dropped out of sight? The answer to the mystery of Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance might be found by tracing his spectacular rise to power. Violence was commonplace in the working world Jimmy Hoffa entered during the late 1920s. Police and strikebreakers battled fiercely with union workers as the labor movement gained momentum. In his teens, Hoffa joined a small Detroit local in the Teamsters Union of Truckers and Warehousemen. As a fearless young organizer, he helped engineer dozens of strikes to improve working conditions. Truckers began hauling more and more of the nation's freight as our highway system expanded. The Teamsters grew into a powerful union. Hoffa moved quickly up the union executive ladder. By the age of 33, he headed Local 299 in Detroit. 11 years later, in 1957, Hoffa ran for international president of the Teamsters. He gained support in locals all over the country by brilliant politicking. When the delegates were polled, Hoffa triumphed by a 3-to-1 margin. Pete Camerata is co-chairman of Teamsters for a Democratic Union.
Well, when Hoffa spoke to the rank and file, he was always able to reach them. And even though Jimmy Hoffa was a little man, he had a certain amount of charisma about him. When you shook hands with Jimmy Hoffa, even though Hoffa was a little fella, 5'5" or something like that, you thought you were shaking hands with somebody much bigger. Hoffa was willing to get right down in the street with the brothers and win what they had to win. And that's what people loved him for.
In 1967, the Master Freight Agreement gave Hoffa more power than any union leader before him. Now, truckers nationwide would be bound by the same contract. To many businessmen and politicians, this was a frightening prospect.
What scared him is the fact that Jimmy Hoffa could say to 400,000 Teamsters or 450,000 Teamsters at the time to park the trucks, and they'd park them.
If Teamster truckers carried most of America's food, fuel, and clothing to the marketplace, is it possible that Jimmy Hoffa had too much power? Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Clark Mullenhoff.
Jimmy Hoffa had more uncontrolled power than any other person in the United States, including the president. He was not accountable to anyone. He controlled employers, he controlled politicians through his gifts of union funds and cash, or through his use of anti-labor charges against the political figures. He controlled everything that moved on a truck.
Hoffa never used his power to shut down the nation's commerce. Publicly, he played the part of a labor statesman.
We're asking for language dealing with safety of equipment. We're asking for wage increase.
People who knew Hoffa said that privately, he was a hot-tempered and ruthless man.
Well, from the first time I met Jimmy Hoffa throughout his whole life, he was a totally confident, cocky, banty rooster type of individual. He could be most ingratiating and pleasant, even boyish.
Pays to have friends.
But he could turn around and snap his fingers and become a tyrant if he were crossed in any respect.
To the rank and file, Hoffa was a powerful boss who won good contracts. Enemies, however, claimed he made deals with employers outside Detroit, allowing them to pay his Teamsters a substandard wage. Hoffa centralized Teamster power and took control of the huge Central States Pension Fund. He lent millions to build gambling casinos. An estimated $170 million of Teamster pension funds went into Las Vegas. There are also charges that Hoffa had ties to organized crime.
From at least the mid-1940s, Jimmy Hoffa was dealing with organized crime figures in all parts of the country. He was using them to enforce his dictates on local labor leaders who were honest. He was also using them as a network for his own advancement and his own power. He put them in power in various unions from one end of the country to the other.
The best answer in regards to hoodlums and what have you is the fact that every strike we have with employers who really want to fight, they revert to hiring hoodlums. And unless we know who our enemy is, unless we're in a position to do something about it, you'll lose your strike.
But who controlled whom? What was the real relationship between Hoffa and men like New Jersey's Tony Provenzano?
You've got people in Detroit, at least 15 who have police records. You've got Joey Glimko in Chicago. I say you're not tough enough to get rid of these people then.
Well, I don't propose to
You haven't moved
tough.
against any of them.
I don't propose to act tough. I will follow the Constitution of the International Union. I don't frighten too easy.
Well, you're not
and I don't intend to have the impression left, as been stated publicly, that I'm controlled by gangsters. I am not controlled by them.
Mr. Hoffa, I'm certainly...
From 1957 to 1963, attorney Robert Kennedy and his brother, Senator John Kennedy, feuded bitterly with Hoffa as the McClellan Committee probed labor crimes. When John Kennedy was elected president in 1960, he appointed his younger brother Attorney General. Bobby declared all-out war on organized crime. Hoffa was indicted for extortion, perjury, wiretapping, jury tampering, and pension fund embezzlement. Somehow, he managed to avoid conviction.
Hoffa's bag of tricks included efforts to buy off sheriffs, prosecutors, congressmen, senators, governors, and he tried to influence cabinet officers, and he at least compromised them. He even tried to buy me off, and he came out just out of the blue sky and said, "Every man has his price, Clark, what's yours?"
After 7 years of prosecution, Hoffa was convicted of jury tampering through the testimony of a disgruntled teamster. Later, he was found guilty of embezzlement. In 1967, Hoffa surrendered to authorities to serve his term. The fateful series of events that would lead to Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance had begun. In 1967, ex-Teamster boss Jimmy Hoffa headed for Lewisburg Penitentiary to serve his term. He may have regretted the involvement with gangsters that had led to his downfall. But Hoffa's knowledge of the underworld would become an even greater burden in prison. For nearly 4 years, Jimmy Hoffa brooded in his cell as his power slipped away. Meanwhile, Hoffa's trusted aide, Frank Fitzsimmons, began his takeover of the Teamsters Union.
I wish to announce that I am a candidate for General President of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters and will run for that office at the International Union Convention, which begins July the 5th in Miami Beach, Florida.
Eligible for parole in 2 years, Hoffa resigned his union office so that Fitzsimmons could run. It was a decision he would later regret. Once elected, Fitzsimmons solidified his position by making friends in the White House. He personally appealed to Richard Nixon to pardon Jimmy Hoffa.
Hello, honey.
How are you?
I believe it.
Unknown to Hoffa, Nixon added conditions to his pardon, banning him from union activity. Hoffa would say later that had he known about the restrictions, he would have refused to sign the pardon papers. In semi-retirement, Jimmy Hoffa found himself trapped in another kind of prison. To Hoffa, freedom, even life itself, meant a return to union power. Hoffa retained his amazing popularity. Observers thought that if Jimmy's lawyers were able to reverse the Nixon restrictions, Hoffa could win back the Teamster presidency from Fitzsimmons. But Jimmy never got the chance. July 30th, 1975. Jimmy Hoffa headed for a rendezvous with 2 Teamster officials, Anthony Giacalone and Tony Provenzano, a former ally with whom Hoffa had had a fistfight in prison. At 2 p.m., Hoffa arrived at the Macus Red Fox restaurant. After waiting half an hour, he entered the restaurant and telephoned his wife to check whether Giacalone had called. Josephine Hoffa has not seen her husband since.
The car parked down here. Remove it now.
Police searched the area for clues or a body. But industrial Detroit provides countless places to dispose of a corpse.
There has been nothing, no calls or notes.
As a police official, what do you think happened?
There's too much to speculate on. I believe it's just too early, perhaps the next 24, 48 hours.
Could someone have snatched Hoffa from the restaurant in broad daylight? Charlie Schatz was an old friend.
Jim would have never walked into a trap. It's been tried before. This has been somebody that's been very close to Jim that he trusted.
Hoffa's foster son, Chucky O'Brien, was questioned. Police found blood in the car O'Brien was driving, but tests proved it was that of a fish. Hoffa's family waited in vain, hoping desperately to hear from his kidnappers. No ransom message ever arrived.
Were you in the Detroit
But
area?
what about the men Hoffa was supposed to meet?
I tell you that Mr. Provenzano hasn't been in this town for the last 15 years.
Tony Provenzano and Anthony Giacalone had airtight alibis for the time of Hoffa's disappearance. Both denied arranging any meeting with Jimmy. Ironically, in 1978, Provenzano went to prison for the murder of another Teamster official. 4 of Provenzano's associates were also summoned to a grand jury hearing: Sal and Gabriel Briguglio, and Thomas and Stephen Andretta. Each refused to talk. In 1978, Sal was murdered gangland style on a New York street. The government still has no case for the murder of Jimmy Hoffa, but the testimony of a mafia hitman turned government informant is considered by the FBI to be a plausible description of the kidnapping drama. Investigative reporter Dan Mulday has been researching the Hoffa case for 5 years.
In the first act, Hoffa drives from his home, arrives at the restaurant expecting to meet 2 underworld figures. He's picked up by 1, perhaps 2 close associates, driven to a private residence 4 minutes away from the restaurant, where he is ambushed and killed. His body is then stuffed into a 55-gallon drum and taken to a location where it is placed in a compactor for junk cars. It is crushed and it is smelted. Hoffa's body will never be found.
If Hoffa's disappearance was a mafia hit, what was the motive? FBI investigators believe Hoffa was killed to protect lucrative mob deals. Joe Irwin knew Hoffa for 3 decades.
Well, they had to get Jimmy Hoffa out of the way because probably within a month he would have been free of his parole deal, and he would have went back into the Union, and he would have taken over without a doubt from Fitzsimmons and crew, and he would have eliminated every damn one of them.
The motive for Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance goes beyond his mere ambition to regain the general presidency of the Teamsters Union, which he was institutionally closed out from anyway. Hoffa was becoming increasingly unpredictable and was becoming dangerous for the mob to allow to continue operating.
Dan Mulday believes an angry Hoffa had begun to squeal about connections between the mafia and the CIA in Cuba. Cuba had long been a stronghold of organized crime and gambling. When the Cuban Revolution broke out, the mob sold arms to both sides. After Castro came to power, he began throwing gangsters out of Cuba. There is strong evidence that mobsters and the CIA were plotting to kill Castro, and that Jimmy Hoffa was the original liaison between them.
The evidence is also clear that in 1975, during the Church Committee's investigation of the Castro assassination plots, that Hoffa was indeed giving information to the Church Committee about his knowledge and perhaps even his participation in these plots. Sam Giancana, who was planning to speak before the Church Committee, was murdered exactly 1 month before Hoffa disappeared. And I believe these 2 murders are connected.
Only weeks before his disappearance, Hoffa had completed a book in which he made bitter charges against Frank Fitzsimmons. He implicated mobsters by name and specifically mentioned the end of his friendship with Tony Provenzano. This book may have been Hoffa's death warrant. Conceivably, he knew enough secrets to send dozens of mobsters to jail or the electric chair. Did Hoffa know the secret behind the crime of the century? On November 23rd, 1963, John Kennedy was shot to death in Dallas. The alleged killer was Lee Harvey Oswald, whose Cuban connections were documented by the Warren Commission. Oswald's murderer, Jack Ruby, had well-known ties to mobsters. According to Dan Mulday, FBI records indicated that Ruby phoned Hoffa aides repeatedly during November 1963.
Might tend to incriminate them. Your complete indifference to it, I think, makes this
Hoffa hated the Kennedys for mercilessly hounding him during the McClellan hearings. But did he know more than the rest of us about the president's murder? Dan Mulday.
In September of 1962, Santos Trafficani, a Florida underworld figure, was speaking with a FBI informant During the conversation, which included Hoffa's personal approval of a $1.5 million Teamster pension fund loan for Trafficani's associates, Trafficani went into a rage over Kennedy's pursuit of Hoffa and indicated to the FBI informant that Kennedy was going to be hit. During my investigation, the FBI informant indicated that Trafficani also added that Trafficani had, quote, made it clear that it was Hoffa who was making the arrangements for the president's assassination.
Jimmy Hoffa's connection with Kennedy's murder is tenuous. More certain is that Jimmy was involved with organized crime. Was he murdered by mob enemies, as the government believes? Could he have fled to avoid assassination, or is he still being held incommunicado? For society, the moral is clear. When underworld power is linked to mighty institutions and charismatic leaders, no one is safe. Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance was the final twist in a long and turbulent career. Gifted with unique talent and charisma, Hoffa could have been one of our country's great leaders. He began on the loading docks and earned his status as a working-class hero. But like so many leaders, Hoffa was corrupted by his tremendous power. He was unable to see the folly of his alliance with the underworld until it was too late. January 1974. The full moon moved unusually close to the Earth. In Search of has found that a strange wave of violent crimes seemed to affect many large cities. Moon madness has long been a persistent myth, which scientists are now investigating with computer technology. Can the full moon drive men mad?
This series presents information based in part on theory and conjecture. The producer's purpose is to suggest some possible explanations, but not necessarily the only ones, to the mysteries we will examine.
We have always feared the night and strange creatures that prowl by the light of the moon. Shakespeare said it best. It is the very error of the moon. She comes more near the earth than is her wont, and drives men mad. The Latin word for moon is luna, which is the root for our word lunatic, meaning moonstruck. And we've tried to contain our fear of the moon's powers in old legends. Many of these myths tell of the moon changing men into animals. One story in particular seems to haunt the collective unconscious of all humanity. The story is so persistent, it must resonate with our basic biological drives. Found all over Europe, Asia, and among many American Indian tribes, the tale is best told in an old German nursery rhyme. My child, take heed, be pure at heart, and say your prayers by night, or you may become a cursed wolf when the moon is full and bright. Of course, there never was a recorded case of a human changing into a wolf. But thousands of tormented souls have been locked away in asylums, howling at the moon. This transformation from man to monster has been a favorite theme of storytellers. Robert Louis Stevenson wrote Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. In the classic film, John Barrymore was praised for his spare use of makeup and strong acting. In the novel, of course, the transformation was effected by a secret potion. But Stevenson's story was based on a true report of moon madness. In the 19th century, Edinburgh was plagued by a wave of senseless, brutal burglaries. Clues led police to suspect a single man was behind the crimes. But who could it be? The last person to suspect was William Brodie, a deacon of the Cabinet Makers Guild, a church elder, and stalwart community leader. Police hesitated to even bother this respected, hard-working man. They reminded him to be on the lookout at the next full moon. The unknown Edinburgh criminal seemed to favor those nights. William Brodie was a classic case of multiple personality. In one body, two souls seemed to compete for dominance. The decent, hard-working artisan could normally maintain control, except at nights of the full moon. Brodie later said, "It was not me. I insist it was not. There was another person in the room with me." The crime wave continued. A reward for the unknown predator was doubled, and only the foolish walked alone at night. Finally, acting on an anonymous tip, police staked out Brodie's shop. At his trial, Deacon Brodie was to base his defense on lunacy, blaming the full moon. The jury was not sympathetic. He was promptly hanged. Miami psychiatrist Arnold Lieber is author of the book The Lunar Effect. His investigations into moon madness have stirred an ongoing scientific controversy.
As a medical student, when I was doing my rotation on the psychiatric wards at the University of Miami Medical School, I noticed a rather interesting situation. I walked into the nursing station and said, "Hey, look what's going on out there. The natives are really restless tonight. What's happening?" The nurses and attendants laughed and jokingly told me, "Well, it's time of full moon. They always go crazy when it's like this." It was at that point that I decided, hey, we ought to take a look at this. Maybe there's something to it, and maybe there's not. If there isn't anything to it, why don't we design a study that will prove that it's malarkey? If there is something to it, then we may be able to make a valuable contribution to preventive psychiatry and criminology. So I set out to design such a study.
The Dade County Medical Examiner's Office was Dr. Lieber's prime source of data. There, tens of thousands of murders had been meticulously cataloged and cross-referenced.
What we did was to examine the murders in Dade County, Florida over a 15-year period in relation to the moon phase cycle. This study was the first time that adequate computer methodology using data samples over a long period of time and from different geographical areas were used in order to obtain our results. The strength of the peaks in our data were quite a surprise to us. what we found was a highly statistically significant increased frequency of murders, both at the full of the moon and the new of the moon in Dade County over a 15-year period.
Miami was the first of several cities Dr. Lieber investigated. In each, he found evidence that violence waxed and waned with the moon. These peaks of violence at the full moon and again at new moon correspond to the times of highest tide. Could it be that some human beings go insane at high tide?
Although everyone's affected by cosmic forces or geophysical forces to some extent, some people are in fact more susceptible to the triggering effects of these geophysical stresses than other people. I'm talking about emotionally unstable people, people in precarious balance with reality anyhow. These are people who are tiptoeing on the edge of reality, borderline personalities, manic depressives, borderline schizophrenics, emotionally unstable individuals. These people seem to be uniquely susceptible to the triggering effects of geophysical or cosmic stresses. Anything may be enough to push them off. These people ought to know about this because there are certain ways that they can protect themselves from the effects. For example, if someone knows that they are uniquely triggered by the phases of the moon or by some sunspot activity, they may want to stay out of crowded places. They may want to avoid the bars. They may want to lock up their weapons at home. With this knowledge, police, fire rescue, and hospital emergency room people can prepare themselves for especially heavy loads during these times. They can lay on more people, they can expect heavier patient loads, and they can be prepared and therefore be in a position to protect life and limb.
Based on his theory of biological tides, Dr. Lieber suspected that January 1974 should be a period of extreme danger. He issued a warning to authorities.
Well, we're having an interesting coincidence of cosmic cycles coming up in about 2 weeks. There's going to be a full moon, a lunar perigee, and an eclipse. And this would be one of the times that we would predict an increase in the murder frequency and also in the qualitative nature, the bizarre type of sex-related murders that we've been having in the other 2 times that we pegged this.
The first week in January, arson went on the upswing. Several cities reported a strange wave of fires and accidents. Emergency rooms were jammed, far beyond the usual Saturday night syndrome. By day, a mood of tension seemed to hang over the cities. The weather was hot and still. Reports began to come in from around the country. Orlando, 2 police patrolmen were slain on duty. Police switchboards reported an unusual number of calls. Then came the time of full moon. For police on patrol, it was a night to remember. A 45-year-old man stabbed his 25-year-old son to death after an argument over a car. Wichita, Kansas, 4 members of a family were shot in their home. Jackson Memorial Hospital, a medical resident was bound, beaten, and strangled. In Miami alone, the murder rate jumped to 3 times normal. A 57-year-old drifter was beaten with a board, and his throat was slashed. No apparent motive. For 3 weeks, violent outbreaks continued across the nation. This was more than enough proof for Dr. Lieber. He considered his theory valid. Certain extreme tides occur once every 2,000 years. The next is due in December 1990. Is there any defense against the madness that may strike again? Twice a day, the ocean rises and falls about 4 feet, pulled by the gravitational force of the moon. Many scientists think that life began down in the depths of the sea. Ancestors of these creatures were lured to the shore and stranded there at low tide. Most died. A handful evolved into amphibians, into animals, ultimately into us. Is it possible we can feel that time 1 billion years ago when we moved from the water up to the land and the air? Our bodies are still 75% water, the same salt water. If the vast ocean could be pulled toward the beckoning moon, could we also be at the mercy of her gravity? This theory of biotides has been received with skepticism by many scientists. Chief amongst them, George Abel, professor of astronomy at UCLA.
The moon is the Earth's nearest astronomical neighbor. Its distance is only 30 times its own diameter. And it's because the moon is so near that it can have an important effect on producing tides. The moon pulls on the side of the Earth nearest it more strongly than it pulls on the side away from the moon, and that tries to stretch the Earth a bit into a football shape. The Earth actually distorts about 8 inches. But I emphasize that tides are only important because they're acting over the entire 8,000-mile diameter of the Earth. It depends on the distance over which they act. A 6-foot man is nothing in comparison. The moon can lower a man's weight by at most 1/100th of a gram, like a mosquito on his shoulder. And the effect of tides on the fluids of a person's body are 30 trillion times less than the weight of those same fluids. It's absolutely impossible that the biological tides can have any effect on human beings. Indeed, the tidal force exerted on me by this globe of the Earth is thousands of times stronger than the tides exerted on me by the moon.
If tidal forces are too weak to influence human behavior, why then have we always felt the moon could affect us so strongly? For thousands of years, ancient peoples tried to solve that mystery. Many temples have been found to be computers in stone, designed to predict lunar phases and eclipses. Is it possible we remember a time when the moon may have triggered another step in evolution, the emergence of the first humans? In small family groups, they roamed the veldt, eking out a bare existence. It was a night of full moon, and they felt an instinct to take to the hunt. That moment is recreated here. They had moved down from the trees. They had given up grubbing for roots and were beginning to hunt other animals, rich in protein. With a hungry family waiting, the hunter knew this was no game. It was life or death. When the moon was full, he could see to track the skittish prey. In a way, at a crucial time in our past, we did turn into wolves. The women who waited found that they too seemed linked to the moon. While the men hunted, they closely watched the night sky to time their own fertility. They seemed to become fertile every 29 days, with the full moon. Legends grew that women were made pregnant, not by men, but by the moon. In modern obstetrics wards, an old belief is shared by many women, the belief that more babies are born at full moon. Nurse Sherry Shaw.
It's an old wives' tale, and we definitely go along and tell the patients that it's an old wives' tale only. But we really see a big influence when the moon is full. Patients just seem to come in. And it's not only here, it's seen in a lot of wards. Every place that I've worked, it's been the way it is. But it's been handed down through the years because my great-grandmother was a midwife, and the story has perpetuated through our family, clear back from her.
I have been hearing for years that all kinds of strange things happened at full moon. And one of the things that's supposed to happen, according to legend, is that more babies are born at full moon. Well, this seemed a surprising thing to me, so a colleague of mine, a man at the medical center at UCLA Hospital, Dr. Bennett Greenspan, And I collaborated on the study of some 12,000 live births at the UCLA hospital over a 51 lunar month period. Now, it would have been very exciting if we'd found some positive effect, but we found absolutely nothing. No effect whatsoever, absolutely random during the lunar cycle. Well, I must say this was quite a surprise to the nurses, because the nurses were all certain we were going to find a very strong positive correlation. I think what happens is that if there's a busy night and the nurses look outside and notice a bright moon, and the moon is bright roughly a third of the time, then they say, aha, full moon, that's why we have all this activity. But if there's not a bright moon, they forget it. It may be a bit like dreams that come true. If a dream does come true, you remember it. But the vast majority of times where it doesn't, you tend to forget.
What then of the flurries of violence and insanity reported at full moon, correlated by statistical studies? Among scientists, widely varying claims have been made.
In any data sample, there are always random fluctuations. For example, if you study homicides against the lunar cycle, you're going to get peaks at certain dates, always. And sometimes they may just happen to occur near full or new moon. But that doesn't mean anything. One has to replicate such a result by many repeated experiments. In the case of Lieber's experiments, he found peaks in one case at full and new moon, or near new moon, but he found slightly different peaks in a different sample and a larger peak at third quarter than at new moon. And other people who have tried to replicate his observations find it impossible to do so. Alex Picorni at Baylor College, Texas, for example, has studied over 7,000 homicides and murders and suicides and finds no correlation whatsoever with phase of the moon or with even the distance of the moon.
We examined aggravated assaults, suicides, fatal traffic accidents, and psychiatric emergency room visits over long periods of time in Dade County. Each of these data samples likewise showed a distinct and statistically significant lunar periodicity. These results have been confirmed and extended by 16 other independent investigators since the appearance of our original paper in the American Journal of Psychiatry in 1972.
You know, I could predict that, say, 2 weeks from Tuesday, that all kinds of terrible things would happen. And I dare say that we could search through newspapers from around the world and easily confirm it.
Obviously, this subject is highly controversial, and in effect, we're dealing with a scientific hot potato.
In this century, we began to dream of actually visiting the moon. A humorous film from 1902 by George Méliès, based on the novel by Jules Verne, shows a spaceship shot from a giant cannon. Méliès predicted that such a journey could have dire consequences, and he showed the moon as a demonic face. Méliès' vision came true in 1968 when we visited our closest neighbor in space. For one brief moment, we learned to fly through the heavens like angels, leaving behind on Earth our violence, our irrational impulses, leaving behind stubborn territorial instincts we inherited from the apes. It's ironic. Those few times we walked on the surface of the moon, the legendary source of madness, were the times we became most sane. The Greeks and Romans worshipped Diana as the goddess of the moon. Beautiful, silvery, chaste Diana was the huntress. In the legends, however, Diana could change into Hecate, the goddess of witches, of evil, insanity, and terror. We've always feared that dark side of the moon. Perhaps we feel that we are really looking into the dark side of ourselves. This is the clearest film ever shot of a real, unidentified flying object. 68,000 UFO reports have been filed in this country alone. Skeptics, however, pose an important question. If flying saucers are so common, why haven't we captured one? In a remote New Mexico desert, researchers have discovered a startling answer to that question. A persistent rumor holds that the United States government has recovered and is concealing fragments of alien spacecraft. Fragments and more.
This series presents information based in part on theory and conjecture. The producer's purpose is to suggest some possible explanations, but not necessarily the only ones, to the mysteries we will examine.
Charges of a UFO cover-up began almost with the first famous flying saucer sightings in late June 1947. It's curious. These reports seem to center around areas where atom bombs and rockets were tested. Were alien forces keeping watch on the new weapons we savages had invented? The flying discs became the Pentagon's nightmare. Seemingly, our fastest jets could never come close to their incredible speeds and right-angle turns. UFOs were said to be able to shut down guided missiles by remote control. The Air Force organized Project Blue Book to officially investigate UFOs. Since its termination in 1969, Blue Book has been alternately praised and damned.
Well, the Air Force position is that we investigated UFOs for 22 years, over 12,000 sightings.
Colonel Don Burgrave, U.S. Air Force.
About 95% of all the UFOs were explainable. They were weather phenomenon, they were balloons, they were airplanes, they were lightning. And we concluded as a result of our investigations, which was carried out very scientifically, that one, there was no threat to the security of the United States, and there was no evidence that we could ever locate that an extraterrestrial vehicle had landed here.
New York lawyer Peter Gersten sued the CIA and FBI to release 5,000 UFO-related documents.
The reading of all the documents reveals that UFOs have the ability to render inoperable present-day technology. UFOs have the ability to gain access to our most sensitive military installations, unrestricted and unlimited access to nuclear installations.
There's no doubt about it in my mind that there's a government UFO cover-up.
Ray Fowler, civilian UFO researcher for 17 years.
I've talked to military people who have told me about government cover-ups, how they've been instructed to say this and to say that. And I worked for the United States Air Force Security Service myself, and which worked for the National Security Agency, and I'm very familiar with intelligence operations and cover stories and things like that. So there's no doubt in my mind that there is a cover-up.
If there was a planned cover-up, then they were very successful in keeping it from me.
Colonel Robert Friend, former head of Project Blue Book, now an engineer on the space shuttle.
A lot of these organizations decided that there was a cover-up because the Air Force didn't pursue these sightings to what they considered the ultimate conclusion.
If there has been a UFO cover-up, it began in Roswell, New Mexico. Near White Sands and Alamogordo, Roswell was home base for many early tests of atom bombs and guided missiles. Here, also, the practice of military stonewalling may have been perpetrated. The case began when Roswell businessman Dan Wilmot witnessed an amazing object over the town. His son tells the story.
This was their home in July of 1947, and it was one summer evening. They were sitting out here. Dad looked up in the west and saw an object that came down and had lights blinking, and it was rather frightening to him, but he said all of a sudden it seemed to rock a little bit and sort of counterbalanced itself, wiggle a little bit, and then seemed to settle down and take off at a rapid rate of speed.
The next day, reporters heard that the Air Force had found fragments of the mystery object crashed on a remote ranch northwest of Roswell. Excitement ran high until officials announced it was only a weather balloon. Major Jesse Marcel, in charge of the operation, now tells a far different story.
They took pictures, of course. They had a whole flock of microphones there. They wanted they wanted some comments from me, but I wasn't at liberty to do that. So all I could do is keep my mouth shut. And General Ramey is the one who discussed, told the newspapers, I mean the newsmen, what it was and to forget about it. It was nothing more than a weather observation balloon, of course, which we both knew differently.
Major Marcel had to keep silent because of his strategic position at that time. He was in charge of all security and intelligence on atomic tests in the United States and the Pacific. Marcel retraced his secret recovery operation across the hot New Mexico desert.
We left Roswell perhaps around 3:30 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. As you can see, it's flat. It is very difficult. In fact, with just verbal directions, we never would have found it. We had to follow the rancher out there.
The crash site was so remote, it took an entire day to drive there.
The following morning, we went out to the site where the crash was. And what I saw, I couldn't believe there was so much of it. It was scattered over such a vast area. So we proceeded to pick up as much of the debris as we could, loaded in the wagon. We filled that up. It took us a good part of the day to do that, because there were such small fragments that we had to do a lot of picking. We found a piece of metal about 1.5 foot to 2 feet wide and about 2 or 3 feet long. Felt like you had nothing in your hands. It wasn't any thicker than the foil out of a pack of cigarettes. But the thing about that got me is that you couldn't even bend it, you couldn't dead it. Even with a sledgehammer would bounce off of it. So I knew that I had never seen anything like that before. And as of now, I don't know what it was.
There is new evidence that the FBI then got into the case with a different cover story. Lawyer Peter Gersten, searching through declassified government documents, came across a mention of the Roswell case.
One of those documents related to an incident in Roswell, New Mexico, which indicated that the object which had crashed was an experimental kite. The FBI investigated the incident and determined that it was terrestrial, that it was from an organization which had been doing research in experimental kites.
What did crash in this desert? A UFO? A weather balloon? A radar-reflecting kite?
It was not anything from this earth that I'm quite sure of, because being an intelligence officer, I was familiar with just about all materials used in aircraft and in our air travel. This is nothing like that. It could not be. It could not have been.
To develop the first atomic bomb, the Manhattan Project was our first totally secret military operation. Secrecy has continued to this day as an instrument of foreign policy. Official fabrications have become a vital link in security. We never admitted such a spy plane as our U-2 existed, until the Russians managed to shoot one from their skies. We managed to capture an advanced enemy aircraft. Even fragments can reveal new information. Such captured material is routinely rushed to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, to the top secret Foreign Technology Division. This place is so classified that former Air Force General, Senator Barry Goldwater, was once denied entrance.
For 30 years, rumors have spread about Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. According to the stories, the U.S. government is concealing under top security flying saucers from another world and alien bodies cryogenically suspended in huge freezers. Such rumors could be easily dismissed, except that UFO researchers have gathered information leaked from military sources, sources who claim to have seen the craft and the bodies.
The stories and rumors all mention a mysterious Hangar 18 as the ultimate repository. In Search of cameras were the first allowed to photograph inside this hangar. Is it possible that here in Hangar 18, highly secret activities once took place? What evidence of a cover-up might we hope to find? Wright-Patterson is one of the largest and most complex air bases in the world. In the Foreign Technology Division alone, hundreds of secret experiments have been undertaken. Continuing military security has made Hangar 18 a mysterious citadel. Some experts believe that new designs have been created here. Every branch of the military has experimented with flying wedges, flying wings, hovercraft, with an amazingly consistent lack of results. The flying saucer shape was an obsession of aeronautical pioneer Edmund Doak. These rare films show static and dynamic tests of his early models. Doak spent 30 years and $250,000 investigating the problems of circular airfoils. Ironically, just when he seemed on the verge of a breakthrough with his Doak 16 vertical takeoff plane, the Air Force canceled development on his projects. No reason was ever given. NASA tested the H-2F2 lifting body as a prototype for the space shuttle. As with all flying wedges, lack of stability was the single unsolvable problem. We are unable to confirm a single successful test of a manned flying saucer. Yet, the effort continues. Why? Does the government have some reason to pursue this quest? A reason they're keeping secret? From Wenham, a suburb of Boston, comes an eyewitness account which could explain this continued military fascination with flying saucers. Ray Fowler, one of the most respected civilian UFO investigators, is also author of 2 bestsellers in the field. Because of his stint in the Air Force Security Service, he finds himself still vulnerable to government pressure.
I work for a company that designed and built a major weapon system. And because of connections within the company, because of connections with Dr. Jalen Hynek, who was an Air Force investigator for many years, I came across information that indicated that this major weapon system, as well as others, had been disrupted by UFOs. And I gave a story to a national newspaper, the Christian Science Monitor, which published this story. Within an hour after this particular paper was out, the Strategic Air Command had called my company. And the following day, the Pentagon called the company and threatened to send a letter of displeasure to the company if something wasn't done about my making these things public.
Because of similar pressures in his own work, a friend of Ray's had kept quiet for 27 years with an amazing story. Ray tried to convince the friend to tell his story on In Search Of.
I know it's been several days now, and I've been waiting for you to call me on this, but have you come to any conclusions?
The man finally agreed, for the first time, to talk, but only under strict conditions.
I can assure you that your name will not be used.
They made up a name, Fritz, to protect the witness's true identity.
And I think the best place to do it probably would be my planetarium, away from the kids and the telephone and things like that.
Waiting for his friend to arrive, Ray nervously fiddled with his telescopes. He remembered his extensive investigations into the man's reliability as a witness.
In the case of Fritz, I started in 1973, went all the way back through the various companies he worked for, right back to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, talked to people he worked with, and they all gave him a very clean bill of health, a reputable man, honest man, not the type that would fabricate a hoax, and a very efficient engineer, manager.
As the man arrived, Ray recalled the years his friend had wavered about breaking an oath of secrecy. He recalled their long arguments about a greater public good. Would the years of patient persuasion at last pay off?
As I understand it, Fritz, you were working for the United States Air Force.
The story began late one night in 1953 at Frenchman's Flat, Nevada. The man had been working as a consultant on blast effects of atom bombs when he was suddenly ordered to report for a new mission.
What happened after that?
We were put on a bus, which the windows were all completely covered with curtains and, in some cases, black paper taped to the windows. And we're driven for 3 or 4 hours, and we're not sure just where we were going. Several of us tried to guess where we might have been. We, at that time, came to the conclusion it was in the area of Kingman, Arizona.
After getting off the bus, as recreated here, the scientists were taken to an even more remote location. They had no idea exactly where they were or what they were about to see.
We were told that we had been selected for various technical specialties. And I was told that I was to ask any questions that had to do with dynamic loads and nothing more, and I wouldn't get any answers to any other questions. It looked like 2 saucers, I would call it, one on top of the other, inverted, probably 25 to 30 feet in diameter.
In terms of something known, what kind of metal would it look like?
Well, it would look like a brushed aluminum. I'm sure it probably wasn't that. I say that because I noticed no scratch marks. And anything that would penetrate into the sand 20 inches that way would certainly have some scratch marks.
No signs of buckling, fracture, or anything?
Not that I could see. I accepted it was probably some United States government vehicle, a highly classified vehicle. In fact, we were told that that's what it was. Interestingly enough, one of the questions I needed to know was what the mass of the vehicle was. Well, I can tell a lot of things from the penetration into the desert sand and so forth, but I needed to know the mass. And they told me that they weren't going to let me know that. They perhaps didn't even know themselves. There was also a tent, which I didn't get to look into, but one fellow whom I did happen to talk with briefly until they told us to stop talking, said that he had seen 2 bodies inside this tent, 2 alien-looking bodies. It was brown, leathery skin, had a silver, like a cap on, without a bill.
Like a skull cap?
Yes, like a skull cap. I realized what this really started to mean, but I also at the same time realized probably why the government was keeping it classified. There are a lot of things that could be changed by our culture or religions. There are a lot of things that could be affected by the release of information like that at that particular time.
Like many other UFO stories, this also concludes with the recovered craft taken to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Cameras are normally prohibited there, but In Search of was allowed to photograph certain declassified areas. We found there actually are huge freezing chambers inside the legendary Hangar 18.
The only knowledge I have of little green men, Martians, or whatever would be from the articles I've read of some of the published novels like Frank Scully's book and things like that.
Don Ritter, building's manager since 1942, claims the giant freezing cells were never used for storage of alien bodies.
Building 18 at Wright-Patterson was used primarily for cold soak engine testing, and we had 4 cells in this facility that we would take down to minus 65 degrees Fahrenheit, soak the engine for some period of time, and make the engine starts to test components, engines, and whatever for cold starts.
My major criticism is that from way back in the 1947s, there should have been a gradual information release and have the public accustomed to what UFOs are, what we're trying to do about them. And instead, they've covered up so long that to admit that they've covered it up, it's almost like another Watergate. Plus the fact, I think they don't have the answers. And if they admitted even what they knew, people would want to know more answers. They don't have the answers to give them. I'm sure they don't have the answers to give them.
Based on my own personal and professional experiences, for the last 26 years of wearing this blue suit, and most of that I've been in the public affairs business, where I'm responsible for releasing information to the public. I can assure you on behalf of the Air Force that there's just no truth to that at all.
Inside the freezing chambers of Hangar 18, we've examined one small clue in the mystery of the UFO cover-up. Whether it proves fact or fiction, this search for flying saucers has already profoundly influenced our perception of our place in the universe. Colonel Robert Friend, former head of Project Blue Book.
I believe that speculation and a scientific approach to it can't live together. I would feel that there were, in lots of instances, cases that had potential scientific pay dirt that possibly should have been pursued further. And in that regard, yes, I think that some of the cases had a lot of promise.
The Roswell case and the strange story of the man known as Fritz are two dramatic examples of close encounters of the fourth kind. Like the 68,000 reports on record of UFO sightings, they exist in a limbo, halfway between science and speculation.